The Silent Hero. Helen Keller is remembered fondly as an educator who overcame the hardship of being blind and deaf to become the first deafblind person to earn a Bachelor of the Arts degree. But one brilliant mind is another. Johanna Mansfield Sullivan Macy, better known as Anne Sullivan, was an American teacher best known for being the instructor and lifelong companion of Helen. She was a woman whose intelligence and passion enabled her to overcome a traumatic past. Anne Sullivan came to Alabama in the March of 1887, and from the moment she arrived, she began to sign words into Helen's hand, trying to help her grasp the notion that everything has a title. With hard work and tenacity, Sullivan would nurture one of the 20th century's leading humanitarians, taking a stand in history. Anne Sullivan was born in Massachusetts in 1866. She was the oldest child of Irish immigrants. Her father, Thomas Sullivan, abandoned Anne and her brother soon after Anne's mother had died. When Annie was 7 years old, she developed trachoma. This infection went untreated, and she remained visually impaired for the rest of her life. Annie and her brother were sent to live in the Tewksbury Almhouse in Tewksbury, Massachusetts. Life at the almhouse was a massive and chaotic place. The two siblings would have been parted, but Anne commanded that they stay together. They were put in the women's ward. Anne Sullivan later stated, "Very much of what I remember about Tewksbury is indecent, cruel, melancholy, and gruesome in the light of grown-up experience." Samuel Gridley Howe, the first administrator at Perkins Institute for the Blind, urged that the State Board of Charities do a careful investigation of the almhouse. In 1880, Francis P. Sanborn and other representatives visited the almhouse, and Anne went to speak with them, demanding her education. Anne made an impression on Sanborn, and a short while after, she began to attend Perkins School for the Blind, the first formal education she had received. After Anne had arrived at Perkins, medical residents suggested that further surgery might help her eyes. 2 surgeries eventually gave her enough eyesight to read print, but Anne's sight differed throughout her life. One of the things Anne studied was manual alphabet developed for the deaf. Manual alphabet was a vital part of Anne's later success in communicating with Keller. Sullivan was the valedictorian of her class. Michael Anagnos wrote to her about the request from the Kellers for a teacher for their daughter Helen. Anne Sullivan came to Tuscumbia, Alabama on March 3, 1887, and from the moment she arrived, she began to sign words into Helen's hand. Though brilliant, Helen was a spoiled child who tyrannized the household with her temper outbursts, and had obtained consent to remove Helen from the main house and live with her alone in a nearby cottage where she could develop obedience in Helen. Anne Sullivan wrote to Sophia Hopkins about the struggles she faced. "As I began to teach her, I was beset by many difficulties. I couldn't coax her or compromise with her. I saw clearly that it was useless to try to teach her language or anything else until she learned to obey me. The more I think, the more certain I am that obedience is a gateway through which knowledge enters the mind of a child." Finally, Annie had a breakthrough. She wrote to her friend about the famous water pump scene. "We went out to the pump house and I made Helen hold her mug under the spout while I pumped. As the water gushed forth, filling the mug, I spelled 'water' into Helen's free hand. The word coming so close upon the sensation of cold water rushing over her hand seemed to startle her. She dropped the mug and stood as one transfixed. A new light came upon her face." Within a matter of months, Helen learned 600 words, almost all the multiplication tables, and how to read Braille. Alexander Graham Bell supported Anne's talent as a teacher. Various times during Anne's time as Helen's teacher, she was accused of being too predominant. Some alleged she tried to form Helen's thoughts and feelings. Once Helen's abilities were known, the public and even some scholars believed them to be too extraordinary for a deaf-blind child. Alexander Graham Bell wrote to Annie. He advised her to teach others in her methods of teaching. He stated, "The principles that guided you in the early education of Helen are of the greatest importance to all teachers. They are true, and the way in which you carried them out shows what I have all along recognized, that Helen's progress was as much due to her teacher as to herself, and that your personality and the admirable methods you pursued were integral ingredients of Helen's progress." A woman named Polly Thompson joined Anne and Helen. She would go on to become a companion and secretary for both Anne and Helen. Anne's health began to decline, and eventually she went blind, but that did not prevent her from traveling to other countries with Helen and Polly, delivering speeches about the blind. According to the American Foundation for the Blind, in 1924, Anne and Helen began to serve for the American Foundation for the Blind as advocates, teachers, and fundraisers, and eventually received many awards for her excellent job with Helen, some of which she declined.
So obviously one of Anne's biggest legacies is her work with Helen Keller. But I think that one of the things that gets skimmed over a great deal is what that really was. So obviously she taught Helen to understand language, and Helen became an amazing writer and communicator. But what was really unique about Anne was just how she decided to let Helen's interests guide what they studied. Helen was obviously extremely intelligent, but the idea of letting the student decide what the topic was really unusual. The way that Laura Bridgman was trained was very much by rote, that Samuel Ridley Howe and her teachers decided what she was going to learn that day, and she learned that thing or she didn't learn that thing. Mm-hmm. It was not a, let's see where your intuition guides you or see where your interests take you. Alexander Graham Bell wrote a letter to Anne where he said, "You did not take to your task standardized ideas, and your own individuality was so ingrained that you did not try to repress Helen's. Being a minority of one is hard but stimulating." And this is part of a longer letter where he's encouraging her to spread how she taught and how she approached her teaching. So directly her legacy is obviously helping Helen fully participate in the world as an amazing writer, advocate, and activist. But she also really indirectly shifted the focus of education, both for people with disabilities and unique needs, but for also many other students, that this is part of a larger conversation about how do we encourage learning and intellectual curiosity and understanding the world.
Jennifer followed up by saying, "I think the thing that we can take away from Anne's struggles and work are three things. First, the power of education to change someone's life. Without the chance to come to Perkins, Annie would have had a very different life, and probably so would Helen. Many people benefited from Anne getting a chance at education and being able to share it with others. Second, that being able to advocate for what you need and want is a tremendously important skill. These are things that were often not encouraged in women of their time, and yet they were critical in both Anne and Helen being able to reach out and help others. The final thing I take away from Anne's story is the power of caring, and caring about doing things well. It is so clear that she was wholehearted about trying to figure out how to teach and then support Helen's learning." She went on to say that Anne is a great example of how to be an advocate while respecting the rights and individuality of others. I also really admire her insistence on doing what she felt was right, even if it wasn't popular or considered appropriate for the times. Anne Sullivan died on October 20th, 1936. According to the American Foundation for the Blind, she dictated messages to Polly shortly before then. "Thank God I gave my life that Helen might live. God help her to live without me when I go." Her ashes were sent to rest in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. She was the first woman to be given this honor on her own merits. She was the daughter of impoverished Irish immigrants. Her life was full of strife and difficulty. She faced an uphill battle but fought not only to have a voice, but to give one to the rest of the disabled community through Helen. She dedicated her life to making Helen Keller the inspiring and empowering mouthpiece and figurehead that she is recognized as today. Her role was in the background. She was the first peg on the road to educational equality for the disabled, and symbolized what it meant to plant a seed in a garden she never lived to walk through. She lived a life of sacrifice and dedication. This is exemplified in her famous quote of, "People seldom see the halting and painful steps by which the most insignificant success is achieved." Her halting and painful steps will forever go down as a turning point for an entire community of the forgotten and underprivileged.